I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you so much. Uh, Thank you, those of you who've given your time to be on our panel to discuss this critical issue. And thank you, Bill Samuels, for your work and for being part of tonight's event. Thank you, Nicole and Caesar and OPEIU Executive Board, and Senator Brown, Mary Mahoney, my partner, and uh, Suzanne and Kyle, who work with Nicole, helping put this together. Thank you all for being here. Those of you who are giving up your dinner or, take working with your children later in the evening. Thank you all. Thank you very much. So tonight, we take another step in engagement. In 2016, we engaged uh, in the presidential election. OPIU had more people in the street, on the phone, handing out leaflets than we had before in our history. And we ratcheted that up in 2018 when we went to Memphis together and took some bold steps like establishing the OPIU apprentice, which has flourished since then. And then we got together and engaged for the 2020 election. And hundreds of you were on the phones, at the text messaging, working with people to bring about that election result, and then further with the Georgia Senate race. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for the work that you did then. And we're going to ask you to get a little further engaged. This is part of our, we started a year and a half ago with a endorsement process, member driven, sent out to all of our people where the results were overwhelmingly in favor of the president. And then we engaged together in the process that followed. So now that that our candidate is in the White House, we seek to change labor law. And we have a House, a Senate, and a president that all seem willing to put this into effect. It's the first time since 1978 that you have these stars lined up again where there's a potential to do this, and a president who's seriously involved and has committed to signing this. So thank you for gathering with us tonight to talk about this important subject about changing labor law. Before we do this, I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about recent experience, very recent experience, in fact. I don't know if there are any but people on the phone from Local 40, but last week, only last week, Local 40 issued a 10-day notice to a hospital in Michigan, and that 10-day notice said that they felt that the hospital had forced conditions through the bargaining tactics. People felt forced to have to give up their labor and strike. My overwhelming majority of the people voted in favor. 10-day notice issued. The International Union gave its certification and authorization. During that process, the employer sent out an email to all nurses in the facility, and it said two things. First, it said that it would cut off employees' health care, which is illegal under the new PPP law because COBRA covers it. But the second thing they said, which goes back to PATCO, which goes back 40 years to the Mackey radio decision in PATCO, it said that the nurses would be permanently replaced. Those of us who are long in the tooth and don't have much hair on the forehead these days go back to the days when this strike leverage was available to us and what it did to help us get better outcomes in negotiations. In fact, You could say, and those who know me well from my years at the bargain table, that my entire career was spent trying to develop leverage for people in different types of situations to bring about better contracts. So if we had no other outcome from the enactment of PRO Act, but to get a repeal or change on the employer's right to permanently replace strikers, if we could have that one issue back on our side of the table. By the way, before PATCO, the number of strikes in the U.S. was under 5% of all contracts. So it's not as though we'd all go strike crazy. But to be able to say credibly that our leverage included this threat, and to be able to take the vote and look at the people's eyes in the room and say that the union can assure they won't be replaced because the law has changed, that alone would make this amendment, but that would make this law worthwhile. But this law goes to the key of why we do what we do and why employers are concerned about what unions can do. Because we're about trying to get respect from employers, and employers respect unions that can organize and unions that can effectively bargain. And this PRO Act, you will hear speakers tonight talk about how the PRO Act enhances the union's ability to organize by creating new procedures, by creating new remedies and new penalties for employers who violate the law, and by enhancing the unfair labor practice process once unions are in bargaining. The last time I remembered this legislative process going this far, I was a student on the Stony Brook campus. It was 40 some odd years ago. I'm very excited to see it where it is right now, that it is supported by this many legislators, and we have a president who's willing to sign. Whether we get this through reconciliation, we get this through a full vote, this is worth the time of writing or calling to your senator and or legislator to say it's time to make change. The balance in the workplace is so far skewed to the employer. I think we all saw that in Amazon. I could, go on all night about what went on there, but it played out on national TV and in social media as that progressed. So let's engage in our discussion. I'm thrilled that all of you are with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here and giving up your time. This is an important conversation that could affect your quality of life in the workplace and your retirement. Thank you, Caesar. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, President Lanigan. I really appreciate you joining us. We have a quick video from Congressman Andy Levin. Oh, we can go ahead and play that.
Hello, OPEIU. It's great to be with you today, and I got to give a shout out, first of all, to Richard Lanigan. Thanks for inviting me, Mr. President. I have to give an even bigger shout out to Local 40. As I'm talking to you, they have issued a strike notice for McLaren-Macomb Hospital. Next time you see me, I may be on that picket line because the workers there have put up with so much. The nurses, all the other organizing the local has done there is incredible. And we've got to win a just new contract for the workers at McLaren-Macomb. Listen, the PRO Act, it's my #1 priority in Congress. And I've been at this, I'm not embarrassed to say it, for almost 40 years. I started helping nursing home workers organize with SEIU in 1983. I was the staff attorney for President Bill Clinton's commission that studied labor law reform. Why is it so important for OPEIU members to hit the ramparts, hit the phones, hit the emails, write an old-fashioned letter, do everything to demand that Congress change our labor laws? Because it hasn't happened just by senators and representatives having lovely conversations in the halls of Congress here. Jimmy Carter tried to pass labor law reform, killed by the filibuster. Bill Clinton tried to at least pass striker replacement, killed by the filibuster. Barack Obama was president. I was involved at the AFL-CIO creating the Employee Free Choice Act, killed by a filibuster. The PRO Act is better, more comprehensive, stronger than any of those previous efforts at labor law reform. It would deal with so many issues, serious penalties for when employers violate our rights, quicker elections, workers deciding where they want to have an election, no captive audience meetings, no mandatory meetings to hear anti-union propaganda, mediation and arbitration for first contracts. So every time workers organize, they would get a first contract within about 6 months. I could go on, but the most important thing is you. I swear to God, the difference between us passing the PRO Act and not is how much of a movement we build. We may have to march around. Some of us may have to get arrested. I've done that before, but we've got to have people in motion organizing to demand change. There's basically no chance that we can rebuild the middle class in this country. There's no chance for justice for poor people and working class people unless workers are free to form unions and bargain collectively again. We're down to 6% of private sector workers having a union. That means 94% don't. 94% of workers don't have a just cause clause. They don't have any contract. They don't have any contractual rights. They can be fired for a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all. This has got to stop. Let's pass the PRO Act. It starts with you. I look forward to working with you to get it done. Thanks.
Wonderful. Awesome. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel we'll be hearing from tonight. First, we have Bill Samuel. He is the Director of Government Affairs at the AFL-CIO. In addition to serving as the chief lobbyist for the 12.5 million member Labor Federation, Bill chairs the AFL-CIO's Legislative Committee, which is made up of legislative representatives from the Federation's 55 affiliated unions. We also have Clarissa Redwine. She is a Kickstarter United alumna and former member of the union's organizing committee. Shortly after joining the organizing committee, she experienced pronounced retaliation and was fired after the highest performance quarter at the company. Just under a year later, the NLRB decided not to move forward with her unlawful labor practice charge, and we'll hear a little bit more about that here shortly. Really excited to have Vivian Chang. She's the Civic Engagement Manager at the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, part of the AFL-CIO, where she oversees APALA's work on elections, redistricting, political activity, and civic engagement broadly. And rounding us out, we have Kelly Russo. She is a union organizer with OPEIU Local 2 based in Washington, D.C. Kelly leads the local's internal and external organizing work, predominantly focused on the nonprofit organizations in the international affairs, advocacy, and environmental sectors. So thank you all for joining us. We'll go ahead and we'll go ahead and kick it off and get started. I will want to point out for those attendees that we have the Q&A section open. There's already been some great questions asked. Feel free to type those questions in and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So let's go ahead and kick it off. So Bill, let's start with you if you don't mind. What is the PRO Act, right? Give us just a basic rundown of the PRO Act and why it's the highest priority of the AFL-CIO today.
First, thank you for having me, and thank you, President Lanigan, for inviting me to participate in this. It's really an honor, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to think about the number of people on this call and how much help you can bring to bear and pressure on the Congress, as Andy Levin said. The PRO Act is really landmark legislation, and Congressman Levin described it pretty well. It's by far the most far-reaching change in our labor laws since the signing of the National Labor Relations Act 85 years ago. It was the crown jewel of the New Deal, and I think most of you know what's happened since. Every year since the New Deal, businesses have spent more money, become more sophisticated at crushing union organizing drives. We're down, as Andy said, to 6% of the private sector, and yet 60 million people want to join a union in the most recent poll. Right now, there's about 12 million Americans covered by collective bargaining. That means there's about 50 million more Americans who would benefit, and even those who aren't in unions benefit, because unions raise wages for everybody, not just union members. Again, Andy went through the main features of this bill. It starts with eliminating right to work in the 20 plus states that have it. It has real penalties, $50,000 per violation, up to $100,000 for repeat violators. That means if they hold a captive audience meeting, if they fire somebody illegally, they're going to pay a price. It's shocking to know, and unfortunately most people on Capitol Hill don't know this, there are no financial penalties for violating the National Labor Relations Act. You can fire a worker and pay no penalty, and that's why they do it on such a routine basis, starting with Amazon all the way down to the the corner grocer. It speeds up elections. It provides first contract arbitration and mediation. As I said, it bans captive audience meetings. It protects economic strikers, as President Lanigan pointed out. What a difference that would make to know that you can go on strike and have your job back at the end of it. It narrows the definition of supervisors and gets at the whole gig economy situation where we have workers not considered workers or employees anymore. They're on their own if they're Lyft drivers or work for Postmates. They would be considered employees and they'd have the right to organize under the PRO Act. And finally, it even provides an individual private right of action for workers whose rights are violated. If the NLRB doesn't take their case, they can go to court. They can go through discovery, and that's never been done. And by the way, that is a right under many other employment relation laws. So this really would modernize the NLRA, bring it up into the to the modern era, and make it equivalent to all the other labor relations statutes that have passed since the National Labor Relations Act passed 85 years ago.
That's that's a lot. And I posted on the chat a fact sheet that it kind of has an outline of the PRO Act. Bill, one other follow-up question. It passed the House. Where is it on the Senate now?
Okay, that's a really good question. This is what I'm obsessed with now. So it passed the House twice, in 2019 and in 2020. It was one of the first bills Nancy Pelosi brought to the floor in both sessions of Congress. Only this time we have the support of President Biden here. I've lost track of the number of times he's talked about the PRO Act and the fact that he wants to build an economy with union workers. It's passed the House. It's essentially pending in the Senate. Right now we have 47 Democratic co-sponsors. We're only three behind. Only 3 Democrats have yet to co-sponsor the bill, and we've heard pretty positive things from 2 of them. And if I can, I'll tell you who they are. Mark Warner from Virginia has not co-sponsored. So if you're from Virginia, pick up the phone, send him an email. Send him a text. There's no reason he shouldn't co-sponsor it. He said he'd vote for it. And in Arizona, both Democrats so far are not co-sponsors, Mark Kelly and Kyrsten Sinema. Kelly has also said he'll probably vote for it, not a co-sponsor. And Kyrsten Sinema has been pretty opaque. She's not saying much about it at all. So we're troubled by that. And we have the possibility of getting Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska. And by the way, when it passed the House, 225 to 206, we had 5 Republicans on it. So we've got to get it taken up by the Senate. We're going to have to deal with the filibuster, the requirement that you get a supermajority, not just 50, but 60. And hopefully they'll change that rule in this session of Congress, because there's so many other bills, maybe not quite as important as the PRO Act, but pretty close. We're going to need to see some changes in Senate rules.
Great. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do our part to get that push through the Senate. I'd like to talk to Clarissa for just a second. Clarissa, if you can tell us a little bit about your experience at Kickstarter, what were some of the tactics management used to stop the organizing efforts?
Yeah, I could talk all day about that. At Kickstarter, we really experienced a lot of the things that the PRO Act is trying to address. We experienced retaliation, firings, even a wide definition of managers that excluded many people that should have been part of the bargaining unit. I myself was sort of threatened with a management title to try and keep me from being part of the organizing committee. We had captive audience meetings where your manager would tell you you had to go, and they would tell us misinformation that luckily OPEIU helped inoculate us before we heard these things. And then ultimately I did experience one of the worst forms of retaliation, which is, just firing me and separating me from the company. And yeah, and there was no penalties or even sort of deterrence from all of the things that we experienced at Kickstarter. And yeah, after about a year of waiting for the NLRB, we learned that only one of the retaliatory firings was moving forward. And even after that firing was moved forward, the penalty was there was no punitive penalty. The only thing the company had to do was pay a small amount of my coworkers, back pay. And then the first time that they had to post anything about our rights under US labor law was after they lost that charge or sort of settled on that charge. So yeah, gosh, I could keep going, but we experienced a lot, and the workers there are still experiencing some of the loopholes and problems in the bargaining process that management is taking advantage of. So, yeah.
Yeah, how do you feel the campaign would have played out if the PRO Act would have been in place at that time?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest things that come to mind is actually something that Bill said. We had quite a few lower level managers that did not have hiring and firing power or disciplinary power that were key drivers in the earliest stages of the drive and had a lot of experience in labor issues, and they were pushed right out at the very beginning. We had, before the drive was even announced, we had a firing of a core union organizer that did a lot of the major outreach at the beginning. And she didn't even file a charge because she didn't realize that she could, and she knew that it was very unlikely that she would get any remedy for that. And having those voices tamped down at the very beginning was extremely damaging to the union drive. And then all of the captive audience meetings where management could spew misinformation and really scare a lot of our coworkers. That was one of the reasons that the election was so close, is because a lot of people were afraid of what would happen after we had a union. Yeah, all based on misinformation from the employer. So I can't stress enough how helpful it would have been to have more supportive labor law in this industry that's so powerful and that has very, very little union representation.
Thank you for that. And by the way, I love that you have a campaign on Kickstarter it's an organizing kit that you've made available on Kickstarter on their own platform. So kudos for that. I really love that. Vivian, if you don't mind talking a little bit about how, your view, your opinion on the PRO Act and how stronger unions translate to stronger communities. Perhaps talk a little bit about how it'll help lessen the wage gap and just help general economic growth.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm a pretty recently new member of Local 2, got my little button right here. So as mentioned, I'm a member of the staff at the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, which is APALA. So we are a labor constituency group. We represent Asian American and Pacific Islander workers. But, just because we're in labor doesn't mean that our staff don't need a union as well. So we unionized just last October, and that experience, we're actually in the middle of contract bargaining right now. So that's it's like I'm with everyone in spirit in the bargaining. But our work has always been focused on exactly what Cesar said. Those wage gaps. Where are Asian American Pacific Islander workers left out? So a lot of times we know. Like we all have personal stories, there's data backing this up, that AAPI workers, they are not informed of their rights. they are left out of the conversation. You know, a lot of times people make assumptions about whether they can even speak English, or if they aren't, you know, very proficient in English, employers aren't giving them the same access to information about, you know, protections in the workplace. So it's like we really are supporting the PRO Act for the same reasons that everyone mentioned, as well as knowing that like our communities are even more vulnerable to the worker rights violations that the PRO Act will prevent and will address. And especially, you know, one of the provisions of the PRO Act is about, you know, making sure that while folks are waiting for their NLRB case to decide it, that they have an economic remedy. And that's so important because there are tons of workers out there who you know, they're supporting family here, they're supporting family overseas, and they can't just, you know, wait without any pay coming in. So there's a ton of, you know, issues that the PRO Act will address, and especially for communities of color, like there's so many ways that our folks get left behind, especially even more, and they're more vulnerable to this exploitation. So we're, you know, really, you know, mobilizing folks to make sure that they know about the PRO Act and that they're talking to their representatives about it. Yeah.
Thank you for all that work that you're doing, by the way, and welcome to the family.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. And we'll have, again, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please go ahead and post them on the Q&A section of the chat, and we'll get to them shortly. We'll have an opportunity to have Q&A shortly. But I do want to welcome Kelly Russo. Kelly, thank you for joining the panel today. Can you tell us about some of the major campaigns that you've been a part of? In your view, how can the PRO Act help OPEIU grow and be stronger through our organizing and bargaining efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. And I, you know, come from an incredible position in that I come from the nonprofit community, and I was able to organize my former workplace, the National Endowment for Democracy, with OPEIU Local 2. And so now I'm able to help support other nonprofits in the DC, DMV community in doing the same. So like you mentioned before, I predominantly work with nonprofit organizations. We've been really lucky to welcome 6 new nonprofit members to OPEIU Local 2 this year, and we have a good number of campaigns that are currently underway. So the organizing world is definitely on fire in a really great way. There's tons of opportunity, and it's a very exciting time, which is why the PRO Act is so important, because staff are finally realizing, you know, that they have the right to form a union, and they're looking into doing so. I want to kind of re-emphasize something that Bill mentioned earlier, which is that via a Gallup poll, 60% of workers in the United States said that they would join a union if they could. But currently, unionization rates in the US hover around 10%. So that 50% discrepancy is massive, and you have to wonder why that's the case. It's honestly a pretty simple answer. Forming a union, although you have the right, in reality it's difficult, and it does carry a level of risk, which Clarissa touched on briefly. So I wanted to talk about a campaign that some staff at a nonprofit called NACHO recently went through, just to highlight, you know, that even for incredibly determined workers who have a vision for their union, it can be really hard to form your union, and there are a lot of deterrents that currently under law you're not protected from. So these staff, they work at the National Association of County and City Health Officials, which is a nonprofit that supports local health departments in progressive programming. So these employees help local health departments with parental health issues, with vaccine deployment and pandemic preparedness, and then tackling healthcare system equity and justice issues. So we started working with them last year in June. So we've been with them for about a year now. And after months and months of really intentional organizing conversations, roughly 75% of eligible employees moved forward in November of 2020 to try and form a union. So they requested voluntary recognition initially, which is when you go to management and you say, we have a sufficient number of employees, an overwhelming number of employees in this circumstance that are interested in forming a union. We want to work in partnership with you. So will you voluntarily recognize us and our union so that we can move forward? Unfortunately, the employer declined voluntary recognition and pushed these staff to an election at the National Labor Relations Board, which is absolutely a recognized process, but it is a very lengthy process under current terms. And a lot of employers recognize it as an opportunity to just delay the bargaining process. And that's exactly what we saw management at NACCHO do, using the NLRB to really drag this out to try and dissuade employees from forming the union, or hoping that enough employees would leave in the interim that they would lose their election. So in early December, staff filed for an election with the National Labor Relations Board. The employer raised a significant number of challenges to who they thought should be eligible for the bargaining unit. So they challenged 50 out of 75 employees, which is obviously massive, well over 50% of the employees we thought were eligible. And the reason that they did this really was just to drag the process out, and they did so successfully. So we went to a hearing that was oversaw by a National Labor Relations Board agent, and we heard all of the arguments for those 50 individuals that the management wanted to be excluded. And then we had to wait for the National Labor Relations Board to make a decision. And that decision took 5 months to be handed down. So back in May, we finally received the decision. And unfortunately, roughly 20 employees were excluded from the bargaining unit on some of these really vague supervisory provisions that Clarissa mentioned earlier. These very broad and hard to nail down provisions that can make it very easy to exclude employees that do not have the ability to hire or to fire or to promote or to reward an individual. So the bargaining unit shrunk a significant amount, so from 75 to roughly 55 employees. In those 5 months, the employer carried out a huge number of tactics to try and dissuade staff from forming their union. So they held over 15 hours of mandatory anti-union meetings where they gaslit employees and worked their hardest to make them fearful of joining a union. The employer canceled their yearly cost of living adjustments. They froze all promotions for bargaining unit staff. They canceled routine bonus programs for staff, which is the only way those staff members are able to get a raise. And then they shared dozens and dozens of anti-union documents with those staff members. And unfortunately, under the current laws, all of those actions were deemed legal by the National Labor Relations Board. So when the NLRB finally released their decision, after months and months of undoing a boss campaign, the staff went to their election. And luckily, they were able to win their election by 80%, which is incredible given the awful boss fight that they undertook. But what that really meant for those staff members who were doing this all on their own personal time was pouring dozens of hours into keeping Solidarity strong, into onboarding new employees without having access to them via work platforms and being completely remote. And so it took a significant amount of work from those employees, and they felt a lot of risk given how the employer was reacting. So the PRO Act is just deeply important because it does exactly what it says it does. It protects the rights of workers to organize, and it prohibits employers from forcing staff to attend these awful anti-union meetings. It requires them to disclose their contracts with anti-union consultants, and it makes sure that elections happen quickly rather than letting them get dragged out for really arbitrary reasons. So.
Wow, thank you. That's quite a fight. Yeah. So I'm curious, it's my philosophy that no matter what the fight is, it's never just for us, it's never just union members. We have to get our communities involved as well. I'm curious, and this is open to anybody on the panel, is in your opinion, how important is it to have conversations, not only in our workplaces, but also in our communities? Have you seen any any challenges maybe with Amazon, or any victories like with the teachers where the communities were involved in some of those victories, and how can we use our communities to help us win the PRO Act?
I can share a little bit about how the community supported Kickstarter United in some pretty critical moments. So after management denied voluntary recognition, after they fired 3 of our organizers in the same week. The community became outraged. Kickstarter is a very like pro-labor space. So there were a lot of creators and people who basically pour money into the platform that stood with the union. And it seems to me like there are quite a few people out there that maybe would be interested in standing in solidarity and fighting for the PRO Act if they only knew the extent to which it would help the labor force. So yeah.
Yeah, if it's okay, I can jump in here. I always love talking about our Apollo chapters because they're doing such, organizing work that work with the rank and file. So just like what Clarissa was talking about, a lot of times we've seen bad bosses who hire, Chinese immigrant workers, and they know that they can exploit them because of their, immigration status, their limited English proficiency. And so the community is critical in these moments because they come out for the pickets. They are literally like embodying solidarity by putting their work on the line because they know that folks who are like undocumented or folks who are working in the shadows, they need strong allies in there with them. And so that's how we've seen really community and labor come together. And the PRO Act just would strengthen that even more. Because a lot of times, when, just like Krista was talking about, just like Kelly was talking about, when folks are fired, when they're facing these unfair labor practices, it's really demeaning, right? It really demotivates you. And so the quicker that we can get, relief for workers, the quicker that, the government can more strongly enforce these punishments on the companies, the better chances these workers have to keep organizing.
I could just make one point about the extent of the support we have. Goes well beyond the labor movement. I mean, we have the largest coalition behind this effort that I've seen in my nearly 40 years in the labor movement. We've got organizations from the environmental community, religious leaders, consumers, groups like Move On, Indivisible, immigrant rights groups. I mean, I think folks get why strengthening the labor movement is good for America generally, for our economy, for our security, and they're all pitching in. And I think they see it as a benefit not only to them but to their communities and their families. So it's very heartening, and that's what gives me optimism that this time I think we'll get this across the finish line.
Great. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to invite our communications director to read a couple of them, if you don't mind, Nicole.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. We have a number of different questions. I'll start with a really about what Bill was just talking about, trying to get this over the finish line. We have a question about from George, who asked, can the PRO Act be passed using reconciliation?
Well, we're not really sure. I would doubt it. What gets through reconciliation is totally up to the parliamentarian. You may remember that back in March when they passed the rescue plan, we wanted to have a minimum wage increase, the $15 minimum wage, and that was tossed out by the parliamentarian. I think PRO Act provisions, one or two might make it in. We're going to do as much, we're going to push as much as we can, and Senator Schumer, the majority leader, is helping us do that. But I wouldn't count on reconciliation procedures being available to most of the PRO Act. I think we're going to have to pass it on its own, and that's why the campaign really is to pass the PRO Act in total. And that does get into a discussion about the filibuster, which I don't want to begin now unless Cesar wants me to. But that's the next big hurdle.
Great, thank you. Okay, so then we have a question for Kelly. Mark wants to know, did their adverse decision from the NLRB include new Biden administration appointees or not?
No, so that did not. Our regional director who's in charge of making those decisions for the DC area is left over from the Trump administration, and so does make a lot of really conservative calls that we have to contend with. I did go through some of the retaliatory actions that the employer took, and so we did file unfair labor practices over those retaliatory actions. They were dismissed by Region 5, and so we did make an appeal to the General Counsel of the NLRB. And unfortunately, it was dismissed again at the General Counsel, who has been brought in by the Biden administration. So a lot of these challenges still exist at the legal level, not just, the political level, but it'll be encouraging to see how things change throughout Biden's administration.
Thank you, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Seth wants to ask Clarissa kind of a question also about the NLRB. He wants to ask about the delay in processing or case that occurred when Peter Robb transferred it to the Division of Advice NLRB because there were members of the committee and coworkers that spoke to the press. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a really good, a really important part of our story for Kickstarter. So when the company fired about a third, like I said, through three members of our organizing committee, which was about a third of our organizing committee in the same week, we filed charges, and we were told by the NLRB, by our local office in Brooklyn, that they were expediting the process because we had a union drive, an active union campaign. And about a week before the election, the NLRB election, our cases were pulled from our local office and passed up to Peter Robb. Supposedly, he sort of personally requested to review them. And that ended up delaying any news from the NLRB for almost a year. So we were waiting for almost a year to hear what happened. It kept us out of a lot of the organizing effort because we could not be in the office. We could not organize to the full extent that we wanted to. And supposedly the reason that our cases were pulled was because we did speak out in the press, and it was part of our pressure campaign to get the company to stop retaliating and to voluntarily recognize the union. So we were essentially punished and undermined by simply using the levers that we had as workers. Yeah, and Seth would probably say that our First Amendment rights were trampled. But, yeah.
And I would agree, definitely. Thanks so much, Clarissa. Corinne would like to know, and I think this is probably best directed at Bill, but maybe Caesar or anyone can jump in. She says, as far as she could tell, the PRO Act doesn't address the racist exclusion of domestic and agricultural workers from the rights and protections of the NLRA. Is there something she's missing, or is there an explanation that she can look to? Bill?
No, she's unfortunately right about that. This does not expand coverage to some of the groups that were intentionally left out in the, back in our darker history. Farm workers are not brought in under this. Now there are many states that are passing state laws, and the same for domestic workers. New York State, I think Oregon, several other states have passed domestic workers bills of rights that have provided basic labor protections. But this version of the PRO Act does not do that. I don't think there was any intent to exclude anybody. But at the time, it was considered that we were biting off a lot here in this bill, and so we hope to, soon, we hope in the next iteration, if we can pass this, to expand coverage under the new law once it's improved.
Thank you. We just have a couple more. Aaron would like to know how the PRO Act allows unions to override right to work laws and collect dues from those who opt out in order to cover the costs of collective bargaining, administration of the contract, et cetera. What would that look like?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, the federal law would preempt state right to work laws. That is possible. Right to work was not even a thing until the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947. There was no such thing as right to work prior to that, to the 1947 Act. And this would essentially repeal Taft-Hartley. By the way, it would also repeal the prohibitions on secondary activity. picketing, supplying companies and others. It'd be a huge new weapon for workers who are trying to organize. So both secondary activity and right to work would essentially be repealed by the PRO Act.
Great, thanks. And this last question we have right now, and please, I'll encourage anybody who has a question, this is the time to put it in the Q&A box. Grace asks, and this is a question I think is on a lot of people's mind, once the PRO Act has been passed, we're going to be positive, will it be something that can easily be overturned by the next administration if it happens, if the administration turns over?
I think I can take that. One of the biggest concerns that we've had with local unions, as a local union rep, as an organizer, is this kind of institutional instability of the National Labor Relations Act. So one administration, under one administration, a group of people at the Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas get fired and permanently replaced under another administration, and are potentially losing their homes and their families. Under another administration, they get full back pay and reinstatement. This is the length of the way the pendulum swings between administrations. One of the things about this law is that it takes the 80 years of experience since the law was passed and looks at these different experiences, and rather than leaving these kinds of issues up to either federal judges or to regional directors or administrative law judges, it codifies or in statute some things that the earlier law did not really clarify. And as we know, it's not really about 51 votes. It's about the getting a secure majority, and then working to ensure the majority in the workplace. So it is going to be then part of our more heavier political profile in our union is the realization that we have to be engaged now in this process to ensure the gains that we've made and try to push the needle further for the families we represent, so that they can work in good conditions, retire with dignity. And that's going to require that people are engaged in their workplaces, in their locals, and in politics. And if that happens, you will see a legislature and a president on a long-term basis that will where this law will become institutionalized and level the playing field. But we're not there yet. It's going to take time, and it's going to take effort, a large effort on the part of people in this community and in other union communities to get this done, because there's a lot of resistance. We face the same kind of resistance. The provisions that were considered to be mainstream provisions in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s are now being referred to as radical. This is a radical bill. This is the same kind of language that people heard in the early 30s and into the 30s when the National Labor Relations Act was being considered, that basic rights of working people, the idea that a working person would have basic rights in the workplace is radical at this time. And that shows you the intensity of the political environment that we find ourselves in. But we have to pull more people into this. As Kelly said, we have to organize more people, and we do. We have to bargain better, because I think that will bring more. We will, by bargaining more effectively and having the right to strike should we need to, that's going to show that we can get better contracts. As we get better contracts, more people will want to join the union, and we will begin to build. We will begin to build the union back better. So I don't think that this will flip, and I don't think that the the instability of the way this law is administered for the last 40 years will really be an issue once this is enacted.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of work to do. And, you know, just like we did with the TPP and other fights that we've had in the past, you know, as we build, we're going to take the fight to our state legislatures as well. Nicole, there was another question?
Yeah, thanks. And there's a couple more. Angela would like to know what can be done to put people's fears about the repercussions of joining a union to rest.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, Nicole.
Thank you.
Currently, the way that, you know, I support folks in forming their unions, a lot of it is based around risk. And so we're constantly having to assess what kinds of risks certain actions take. And we're very honest with employees that you have to constantly be doing this kind of risk assessment. And so everything that we do, while encouraging staff to remain strong and vocal, is done to minimize that risk. So we luckily have legal counsel on hand to support staff if issues arise, serious issues like those that Kickstarter went through, which is always a wonderful resource to offer to employees who are looking to form a union. But really it involves a lot of building community support, figuring out what employers are scared of, and doing really, you know, deep power analysis to understand, okay, this employer cares a lot about the opinion of X individual or X entity. How do we put pressure onto that entity or that individual to influence this organization, this employer, not to retaliate against their employees? And so it does take up a significant chunk of the organizing process, doing that risk assessment and doing that power mapping to make sure that retaliation, or to try and prohibit retaliation from happening.
Thank you very much. And kind of the other side of the coin, we've had several questions from people talking about union busting, and if the penalties are strong enough to disincentivize union busting. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
From the perspective of organizing specifically with nonprofits, it would be an incredible incentive. You know, staff care deeply about the mission that they're working towards, and wasted money, especially if it's from the employer doing something unlawful, would be such just an awful image hit for them. In terms of finances as well, nonprofits are not known for having a lot of money. And so I think that they would step much more carefully if there were actual financial you know, incentives for them to do so.
That's really it for questions at this point, but we do have a lot of people raise their hands and things like that. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in. We just have a few minutes left here. We've got time to answer them. So if you do, but right now, Caesar, that's it.
Rich, you wanted to add something to the last one?
Well, you know, as I said in my earlier comments, I remember when I was a kid when the last major effort toward labor law reform during the Carter administration was in the 70s, and it was a direct response to the egregious violations that were basically the business model response by J.P. Stevens in a campaign of many different textile plants that were being organized through the late 60s and right through the, about an 10-year period during the early and mid 70s. You know, closing plants, threatening people, firing people, and what happened was at that time, the employer realized, and I actually wrote a column in the White Collar for anybody that might have seen it. The employer at that time began to consider the cost-benefit analysis of whether or not it would be cheaper to violate labor law than it would be to take on the union, to actually bargain a union contract and make change in the workplace. This area, for those people who are, think of these esoteric little differences, is not financial and probably could be done through reconciliation. It's called remedies. And, if it gets down to that in some midnight negotiation weeks or months from now, when this is really being hammered out, it's a possibility. But if the remedies were put back into the NLRB, brought up to date, we had things like treble damages, full back pay, and real teeth in the law, they would be better. I mean, Clarissa spoke to an unfair labor practice charge where Chairperson Robb shelved the unfair labor practice because it was mentioned in the media. That case was not the only case where that was done. Our local 153 in New York had 2 or 3 other, including the Municipal Credit Union and elsewhere. Other unions experienced it too. So it's clear they don't want publicity, and they don't want the community to know about it. They don't want the consumer to know about it. They don't want God-fearing people to know about it, and they don't want to have to pay money. If we can put the ability to communicate back into the law, and I think that is easy enough to do, and real meaningful penalties, damages, then the employer will, then that will prevent an employer from intentionally firing a union organizer or a committee to try to scare people. And it's those kind of changes that if that happens here, it's going to level the playing field back in the workplace in ways that haven't been seen in decades.
Thank you. Thank you, President Lanigan. And thank you to the wonderful panel for joining us tonight. It's been really fantastic conversation. I wish we could really keep it going all night. But one thing's for sure is that OPEIU has incredible organizers and great allies to help us in our effort to make our union stronger. So thank you once again. At this time, I'd like to welcome a very special guest, Senator Sherrod Brown, who has shown working people over and over that he is on the side of unions. Just earlier this month, the senator sent a letter to the CEO of Defenders of Wildlife, who refused to recognize organizing efforts by OPEIU Local 2. I'll post a link on the chat so y'all can read the letter for yourselves. Thank you, Senator Brown, for joining us for tonight's discussion. First, on behalf of all the OPEIU members, let me also thank you for your continued support. Please tell us why unions are such an important part of your platform and why the PRO Act is such a priority for you.
Thanks, and thanks for giving me a few minutes to say a few words, and I'd be glad to do questions. I think you want to stick around for a few minutes and do all of that, so thank you, Cesar. And President Lanigan, nice to hear your comments and how important they are. Thank you for that. I've been doing this for a while, and I look with great optimism in the months ahead. We're finally seeing what it looks like to have a government that actually is on the side of workers for the first time in a long time. Neither party of the United States is putting workers at the center of the trade agenda, the tax agenda, everything we do. For too long, presidents of both parties and particularly Republicans in the House and Senate have put corporate interests front and center every single time. I'll illustrate with a real brief story. Back probably early February, I think it was, I was for the first time in the Oval Office with Joe Biden. And there were 7 or 8 new Democratic committee chairs. I chair the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Used to just be called the Senate Banking Committee, where Wall Street ruled. Now it's the Banking and Housing Committee, and we're going to continue to see. We've done hearings on structural racism. We've done multiple hearings on climate. We'll continue to focus on housing and getting people opportunity in this country. But so a group of us were at the White House, and Biden, the president, had each of us in the room just kind of go around the room. What are you working on? And I mentioned the pension bill, the multi-employer pension bill. I mentioned the child tax credit, which I've been working on for 7 or 8 years. We were successful at that, as you know, cutting the child poverty rate in half. This was at the beginning of the session. And then I also brought up the Protecting Our Right to Organize Act and bill, and I closed it. The president said, Mr. President, thank you for using the word union. And he kind of smiled, and then as soon as the meeting was over, he made a beeline over it. He said, Sherrod, why wouldn't I use the word union? And I said, well, I've been in this office a number of times with a number of presidents, and this is the first time I hear someone talk about unions the way that you do. We're already seeing results. We're seeing wages go up. We're seeing the corporate lawyers essentially thrown out of the Department of Labor. We know that when Scalia was Secretary of Labor, I know President Lanigan knows all about this. When Scalia was Secretary of Labor, he himself was a big corporate lawyer at one of the most anti-union big law firms in the country, located in Cleveland, Jones Day. He brought in all these other corporate lawyers. They had appointed NLRB members who never stood up for worker rights. That's all changing now. We're putting money in people's pockets with a child tax credit. We have momentum behind the labor movement that I haven't seen in decades. Fights like the Amazon organizing drive in Alabama, unsuccessful, as we know. Too many of these drives are unsuccessful. People, though, around the country are starting to understand better how the system is rigged against workers. We have to seize this opportunity for protecting the right to organize in our bill. This week, Gracie Heldman from Ohio, she's been trying to organize I believe it's called the Consolidated Biscuit Company for 20 years, and they've engaged in all kinds of anti-union activity. She has pointed out so well to this committee what's wrong with labor law and how we have to fight. Your union, I know, has been fighting to organize defenders of wildlife. As Cesar said, I sent the CEO a letter asking him to voluntarily recognize the union. We keep the pressure on. We know how important it is that we work with unions that are organizing. To me, it's all about organizing to create the middle class. You love this country, you fight for the people who make it work. That's what the dignity of work is all about. I'll close with this and then be glad to take questions or discussion, however you have this set up. When I wear a suit at work, I have a lapel pin I wear, and it's a depiction of a canary in a bird cage. It was given to me at a workers' Memorial Day rally by a steel worker. As you know, every April, in places around the country, the labor movement honors workers who were killed on the job or injured on the job. This canary in the cage, you know the story. The mine workers took the canary down in the mines. The canary died from toxic gas or lack of oxygen. The miner got out of the mine. He had no union 120 years ago to protect him, and he had no government that cared enough to protect him. And this pen reminds me of what our fight's all about, that our fight is for workers. Our fight is whose side are you on, to put government on the side of workers, to put the center of our trade and tax policy should be workers, as we take on Wall Street, as we do all the things, fighting for jobs, fighting for workers. That needs to be the center of our attention. So thank you for what you do with OPEIU. Thanks for making these fights, and count on me to be there for you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Great comments. I appreciate it. I do have one follow-up question. The executive director for Mi Gente, Latinx organization, likes to say, and I quote her quite frequently, is that we don't elect our savior, we elect our next target, right? So it's up to us to put pressure on our elected officials. In your opinion, what can we do as union members to put pressure on those representatives to pass the PRO Act? What works?
Well, there's good question. There are 3 senators on the Democratic side who have not co-sponsored, the 2 from Arizona and a senator from Virginia. I suggest working particularly with the labor movement in those states. I know we're already doing that. We need to get all 50 co-sponsors. We're 3 short, as I said. I'm hopeful we could get Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. I used to certainly engage with her, Republican. She's probably our only shot among Republicans. We then need to relax the filibuster. We need to relax the filibuster for 2 issues: voting rights and worker rights. And Democrats, pro-labor Democrats, progressive Democrats, I mean, if you're running for office as a Democrat, you care about worker rights and you care about voting rights. And you care about women's rights and gay rights. I mean, rights generally, but fundamentally, we're a party of human rights, and that includes worker rights and voting rights and women's rights. And I think you just continue to tell stories about how labor law is rigged against us, against the labor movement, and get to those 3 senators and keep the pressure up on the president to push for it, and keep the pressure up on leadership in both houses to push for it.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us in tonight's discussion. Our members will be mobilizing over the next several weeks to educate fellow coworkers and their communities about the PRO Act. So be on the lookout for a delegation to visit your office in Ohio to thank you in person. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Look forward to that for sure.
Thank you. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Good luck to all of you. Thanks.
Senator Brown? Nope. Okay.
Oh, you still there? Okay, I thought you were. Go ahead.
Senator Brown, I just want to say that I saw your optimism and was inspired by it during the fight over the Butch-Lewis Act. You were one of the bright lights, the 3 or 4 hardcore senators who said this can get done, this will get done, you know, against all the cynicism and all of the people who said funding people's pensions was immoral and funding people's pensions were wrong, and why would we do this after these pension funds lost all of their assets like they did during the 2008, after General Motors and major airlines were bailed out and pensioners were left out in the cold. I watched what you did. I saw that especially that week where people walked through the halls of the Capitol, where the retirees were there. But I mean, not just that time. All the many months, the years that you were in this fight to see this change. I would just want to thank you on behalf of 5,000 pensioners who come from the local who are in a toxic plan, who come from the local that I represent, who will all sleep better and have a better and more dignified retirement, and other pension plans within the OPEIU that face the same situation. I just want to thank you for the work that you, from the bottom of my heart, in all sincerity, thank you for the work that you do for us every day, but also thank you for that accomplishment, because it really looked like that was an impossible thing to do. I think labor law looks impossible now too, but it takes optimism and stick-to-itness to make these changes happen. And I saw you do it, and thanks for the work you do.
Well, thanks for saying that. And I mean, that's one thing I've learned here. Sometimes it takes years. The child tax credit, I first went to President Obama and asked him to veto a corporate tax bill, to threaten a veto so we could get some room for the child tax credit. And that was 8 years ago. And this past 2 weeks ago, 60 million children got help from the federal government, some 35 million families, many of them struggling workers, many of them living on the edge, a number of them in poverty. Will reduce the poverty rate by 50%. Then the same bill was the Butch-Lewis Act. And I was afraid we were at some point going to have to say to pensioners, you're going to have to accept a 30% cut. Otherwise, you're going to lose everything. I dreaded that day, and we dug in, and Senator Casey and some others really helped. And both of those were persistence, but both of those happened. I mean, okay, I'll take some credit for it, but they happened because people in the labor movement didn't give up. I can't count the number of rallies on Butch-Lewis. Hot summer days in Washington where 500 people, not usually particularly young people, would be standing in the summer, humid, 90-degree day. And then I remember the cold days in February doing rallies out by the Capitol. And it was really the stick-to-itiveness and the assertiveness. And that's what the labor movement's so damn good about, never giving up. And so if we could do the child tax credit, it took 8 years. We could do Butch-Lewis, took years. We can do the PRO Act, and we can do the protecting the right to organize. And if we're going to have a middle class in this country, we need a stronger labor movement. I grew up in a labor town where most of the jobs, industrial jobs, Mansfield, Ohio, have been lost. Westinghouse, General Motors, Tappan Stove, Gorman, a zillion good paying, mostly union jobs. And I know what it can be, and I know what I want to get back to.
Thank you again.
Sure. Thanks. Enjoyed being with you. Thanks for those last comments. It made my day. Thanks. See ya.
Thank you.